Again, good afternoon. I'm going to immediately then go into a sermon this afternoon that is specific to the time of year we're in. I hope will be meat in due season. As of tomorrow evening, if you're keeping track, it will be 3 weeks from tomorrow evening when we sit down to observe the Passover this year. It is by far the most meaningful evening of the year for a true Christian. A few weeks ago, Mr. Lamore asked me if I would consider developing a sermon on the progression of the Passover observance as we see it recorded in the Bible. And then he in turn is doing another sermon, which I believe you will hear next week, follow up to that, building on it. And I looked at this and I said, well, certainly I'll be glad to do that. I did struggle to select a succinct title. Not because I don't know where I'm going. I know where I need to go with this sermon. But, a title that gives an accurate definition. I considered this 3 ways to keep the Passover, but I scrapped that real quickly because I'm not going to be giving you 3 options on how to keep the Passover. Instead, I'm going to talk about the history of it as it was instituted and then as we progress through the Bible. Do we realize that the changes that God has made in the way the Passover was to be kept, his direction in keeping it, leads up to where we are today? Everything that was required from the beginning pointed ahead. So what I want to do is go over 3 distinct ways that the Passover was observed according to God's direction from the Bible. I'm going to begin with the first recorded Passover, and it's sometimes called the institution of the Passover. As a matter of fact, you can begin turning to Exodus chapter 12. In Exodus 12, I actually have a heading in my Nelson version of the New King James Bible that actually says that. The Passover instituted. How many of you have heard, and I was thinking about this as I was developing the sermon, so I want to ask, how many of you have heard that the Passover was kept before the time we read about in Exodus 12? I'm just curious. A long time ago, I heard this on more than one occasion, and I heard this from men who were faithful, loyal, men of God, ministers in the church of God. And I thought I'd comment about that just momentarily. One scripture that lends support to that is back in Genesis 26. Now, you don't have to turn there. I asked you to turn to Exodus 12, and that is where I will begin actually covering scripture. But in Genesis chapter 26, there's a very interesting statement. The statement was made after the death of Abraham. And that chapter begins with the Lord God interacting with Isaac, his son, the son of promise. And great promises and blessings were being reiterated to him. But why were these promises coming? Because it says in verse 5, and I'm not going to turn there either, but this is what it says as close as I have it memorized. You're receiving these things, Isaac, because Abraham obeyed my voice. In other words, he did what I told him. And then it continues, and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Do you remember that scripture? It's in Genesis 26:5. And when you think about that, that's very broad. Abraham obeyed my voice. He did, again, what I told him. kept my charge, followed my instructions, and my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. But we have nothing revealed about the Passover, so it's entirely possible those patriarchs observed the Passover in some way. We just have no record of it. Let's go then to the first place in the Bible where we have record, Exodus chapter 12. Let's begin this afternoon in verse 3. Exodus 12:3. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for the household. And in verse 4, if the household is too small for the lamb, in other words, not enough members in that household to eat it, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall make your count for the lamb. So I'll stop there a moment. This lamb was separated on the 10th, and lambs in that era were smaller. If you study that a little bit, today we fatten them real quickly, right? You and I and our next door neighbor would be hard pressed to consume a lamb today, but number one, our households are smaller, but number two, the lamb in that era was also smaller. Verse 5, your lamb shall be without blemish. As near as they could find the perfect lamb, a male of the first year. It had to be in its first year of life. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. And every time I read that, and I've read it often, I do think about that. We always associate a lamb with Passover, but a kid, in other words, a young goat, was acceptable as well. If that seems odd to you, you'll have to take that up with God, because this is his instruction through Moses. Let me continue with you verses 6 and 7. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. Kill it in the evening, and they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. We know that very well. And we know what that was going to do. I don't have time to cover everything around this, but the blood of this lamb without blemish, daubed on the sides of the door frames and over the top, was going to protect them from the death angel, which would and did pass through the land there in Egypt that very night. And that death angel took the life of every firstborn in Egypt, not only of men, but even the firstborn of animals. Very significant, the protection of that blood. Now, some more specific instruction, verse 8. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire. With unleavened bread and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. So even here, things are prescribed. It was to be roasted, not boiled, or prepared in any other way. They were to eat it with unleavened bread and these bitter herbs. Now, it is interesting, no wine is mentioned. No wine is mentioned. Now, the Jews added that by tradition, and that's what the Jews have done a great deal of, right? They add many things, did add by tradition, but wine is not mentioned here. If any of you are very familiar with the Jewish Passover, as it is still kept, they drank 4 cups of wine. It's quite a considerable amount if you study it. But back here, no wine is mentioned. Let's go to verses 10 and 11. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. Thus you shall eat it with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, so you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. Now, that word Passover right here, verse 11, is the very first occurrence of the word Passover in the Bible. First mention of the Passover is right here. And then it goes on. That death angel was going to pass through the land that night. And that happened. And when that blood was observed, the blood of that lamb observed on the sides of the door frames and over the header, they were spared the physical death of their firstborn. I want you to go and note something else with me late in this chapter, and that's in verses 43 through 49. I'll skim some of this, but late in that chapter, verse 43, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat it." There's a lot of meaning here. No foreigner shall eat it. But every manservant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he may eat it. An outsider could join, but only after circumcision. I'm going to skip to verse 47. I will note something in verse 46. In one house it shall be eaten. Now a neighbor could join, but in one house it shall be eaten. And you shall not carry any of the flesh outside the house. You shall not break one of its bones. There's so much meaning here, too. I'll never have time to cover it all. But in verse 47, all the congregation of Israel shall keep it. And again, emphasis is given. Verse 48, and when a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it. Skipping ahead a little bit, for no uncircumcised person shall eat it. One law shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you. So much here. The matter of circumcision, I'll comment about that near the end of the sermon to try to tie all of these things together. As brief as I can make it, that's a coverage of the institution of the Passover, at least the first account of it that we read in the Bible. Then, I'm going to skip ahead to a change in the Passover ordinance, and I'll cover that with you in Deuteronomy chapter 16. Please go with me there. Deuteronomy chapter 16. This is some 40 years later. More accurately, this is close to 41 years later. And now, Israel is poised to go on into their promised land. And Moses is reiterating a lot of things in the book of Deuteronomy, instructing them on what they're going to do in the future. And there's a change here. If you're with me now in Deuteronomy 16, I'd like to begin with you in verse 1. Observe the month of Abib, or Abib, and keep the Passover to the Lord your God. For in the month of Abib, the Lord your God brought you out from Egypt by night. I don't have a lot of time to dwell on that, but that has to do with timing. I didn't cover that back in Exodus 12, but in Exodus 12, they were told they could not go out of their houses until morning, right? If you recall that. That word translated morning can mean dawn. It's the beginning of the daylight portion of a day. They were brought out, though, by night. That is the night we today reflect on the night to be much observed. Matter of fact, here in Deuteronomy it says that. It shall be a night to be much observed. But I don't have time to dwell any more on that. Let's continue here. Deuteronomy 16, verse 2. Therefore you shall sacrifice the Passover to the Lord your God from the flock and the herd. So it still remains a lamb or a kid. If you have sheep, you have a flock. If you have goats, you have a herd, right? The goat herd. I think of the Sound of Music. The goat herd. A boy herding goats. So again, nothing changed there. It could be either one. Now let's continue reading there, or to make it flow, I'll reread it. You'll sacrifice the Passover to the Lord your God from the flock and the herd in the place where the Lord chooses to put his name. What has changed? The place. In Exodus 12, where did they sacrifice and eat the lamb? In their homes. Their homes, sometimes along with a neighbor. Now, there's a distinct change. You're going to do it in the place where the Lord chooses to put his name. Verse 3, again, they were to eat no leavened bread with it. Again, no significant change there, but drop down to verse 5. It repeats, you may not sacrifice the Passover within any of your gates which the Lord your God gives you, but at the place where the Lord your God chooses to make his name abide. There you shall sacrifice the Passover at twilight. Excuse me, at the going down of the sun. Verse 7, it's repeated again. It's interesting when I was studying this or restudying it. Once again it says, and you shall roast and eat it in the place which the Lord your God chooses. And in the morning you shall turn and go to your tents. Now at that point, they're all living in tents, but they couldn't sacrifice a lamb on their own premises. Now it has to be where God was going to put his name, which would be revealed to them later. That's very interesting, I think. It wasn't always in the same place. We might immediately think of the tabernacle and then the temple, and that's true. That's where God chose to place his name, and I'll comment about that here in a little bit, because that's where the Passover in those eras was kept, where the lambs were sacrificed and so forth. So there's a distinct change. There's another change that I'll just touch on. Ezra 6. Ezra chapter 6. Here we have Ezra the scribe. I won't read too much of the account here. The Passover, by the way, had been forgotten. We're jumping way ahead. When did Ezra live? Well, Ezra is serving God long after the time of the judges and after the period of the kings. Israel forgot the Passover many times. I can say that with confidence. And you can too, can't you? Remember some of the reforms? Men like Hezekiah. Remember that? They had to start over. Men like Josiah. Started out very young, but he was a very faithful king in Judah. Remember some of those accounts? They were cleaning the trash, if you will, out of the house of God, and they found the book of the law. Remember that? That's how far Israel had gotten away from God. And they began to read it, and oh, we need to keep holy days. Of course, that included the Passover. But they kept forgetting. Now, there were many, many sins and faults which led to first the northern tribes being taken into captivity, and then later Judah, along with Benjamin and much of the tribe of Levi. They ultimately went into captivity as well in the 580s BC before Christ. After 70 years, Ezra, Nehemiah were charged with doing their work when some of the captives came back from Babylon to rebuild the temple and the wall around Jerusalem and so forth. So I'm quickly bringing you up to speed in some of these eras. But what I want to note with you, if you're in Ezra chapter 6 now, begins in verse 19. They're beginning to keep the Passover again. In Ezra 6:19, and the descendants of the captivity kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month, for the priests and the Levites had purified themselves. All of them were ritually clean, and they slaughtered the Passover lambs for all the descendants of the captivity, for their brethren, the priests, and for themselves. Then the children of Israel who had returned from the captivity ate together with all who had separated themselves from the filth of the nations of the land in order to seek the Lord God of Israel. The change that we're reading about here is the priests, along with Levites, were now slaughtering the lambs. But all of Israel collectively were to eat a lamb. That doesn't change. Now, we're going to move ahead to yet another change, although maybe I should comment once more. What we just read, not simply the priests and Levites slaughtering the lambs, but going to the place where the Lord your God chooses to place his name, was a massive change from simply killing the lamb yourself, eating it there within your own home. Now, going to the place where the Lord your God chooses, when Israel was faithfully doing it, was being done in Christ's time. How can I say that with confidence? Let's go to Luke chapter 2, the New Testament, Luke chapter 2. Faithful Jews were still doing this after Ezra and Nehemiah's time. We don't know a lot about what happened in between, but here we come now to the time of Christ. Luke chapter 2, late in the chapter, if you would begin reading with me, please, in verse 41. Luke 2:41. Talking about Joseph and Mary here, Christ's parents, went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover, because that's where the Lord had chosen to place his name in that era, at the temple. And they did this every year. Christ went with them when he was 12 years old, it says. They went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. Verse 43, when they had finished the days. Now it begins with Passover, but when they had finished the days, plural, as they return. They return. What are the days? Well, that would be the days of unleavened bread. This is sometimes called a pilgrimage feast. They all had to go up to Jerusalem. That had to be something. all of the Jews coming to Jerusalem. There are a lot of sources, and even last night, I was reading some more on this. A lot of sources, and they differ a great deal. A lot. Josephus, for example, the noted Jewish historian, Josephus, and you can find this in many sources, but he said he personally calculated 256,000 lambs were sacrificed in this era. And his formula was 10 people for each lamb. I will quote what some other ministers have said, and I share that view. Josephus was prone to exaggerate for effect. Because if that were, again, his formula, 10 people for each lamb, you've got over 2.5 million people there, don't you? Now, we don't know. There's another record, and I was reading this from an account in Shabbat. It's a Jewish website. There's an estimate there that's as low as 18,000 lambs. But still, if any of you study this, it's interesting. I will also tell you it's not critically important to the Passover that you and I will keep. But the point is they were still doing it with a change again, going to the place where the Lord placed his name. And when you think about this, there was blood all over the place. The priests were sacrificing at the Temple Mount. But you can find sources that will tell you, and this is very logical, they were also slaughtering lambs throughout the environs of Jerusalem because of so many. Blood. How did they dispose of it all? Think it through. I'm going to use that account to transition to a far greater change. Number 3 here, the Passover change that was enacted by Jesus Christ. Let's stay in Luke, but go now nearer the end of the book to Luke chapter 22. In Luke chapter 22, I'll read verse 1 with you and just comment briefly on that. Verse 1, now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called the Passover. That can be a little confusing in the Bible. The words Passover and days or feast of unleavened bread were used interchangeably. Sometimes the Passover assumed to be the entire spring feast, or vice versa. But this is the time. Now, I won't read the next verse because what I want to do is dwell on the very important thing of this next change in the Passover, and let's begin in verse 7. Luke 22, verse 7, then came the day of unleavened bread, this one day when the Passover must be killed. So the Jews, of course, were still doing this, killing Passover lambs, and probably young goats too, although that isn't mentioned here in the Gospels. Read with me the next 5 or 6 verses, beginning in verse 8. He, Christ, sent Peter and John, saying, go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat. And they asked him, verse 9, where do you want us to prepare? Now, I don't think they could comprehend anything other than the Passover they had traditionally kept. But he's got a plan, and they're going to learn it. Verse 10, I'll skim this. He said to them, behold, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house where he enters. And then you shall say to the master of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? It was all planned. Verse 12, then he, this unnamed person, will show you a large furnished upper room. There, he said, make ready. I don't think they understood exactly what they were making ready for, but they were good, obedient servants. In verse 13, they went and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover, or prepared for it. Christ has something different in store. Now we know this. This is yet the biggest change. All through the centuries, going all the way back, 1400s BC, when God brought Israel out of Egypt, they had sacrificed these lambs first in their homes, had eaten the unleavened bread and the bitter herbs and so forth. Later, what we just read in Jerusalem or wherever the Lord chose to place his name. Now they're still doing that. Where were these men from? Galilee. So they had come up to Jerusalem, according to the custom of the feast. But now, in verse 14, when the hour had come, we know that to be sundown. He sat down, that's Christ, and the 12 apostles with him. And he said to them, this is so meaningful to me. The other gospel writers record this a little differently, but Mark records it, as we have it translated, with fervent desire. That's what Christ said. With fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. And then he says, I say to you, I will no longer eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Christ is going to observe a Passover yet in the future, in the kingdom of God. I'm very anxious to see how that is observed. God willing that I finish my race and you do. We'll have yet another keeping of Passover in the kingdom of God. But at the time Christ was doing this, let's continue the account. Verse 17, he took the cup and he gave thanks and he said, take this and divide it among yourselves, for I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. So, once again, he's going to share wine with us. Verse 19, and he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and he gave it to them, saying, this is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. This would have been brand new to them. Brand new. But this is Jesus Christ instituting this. He's the one who makes the rules. Verse 20, likewise, it says, he also took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. Incredible meaning here. Christ institutes these symbols that had never been taken before. And I wonder and I muse how these 12 men grasped this and envisioned what it meant. Now later on, when they received the Holy Spirit, I have no doubt they understood fully what these symbols meant. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew 26. A companion account with Matthew rendering it just a little bit different again as we read it in English. If you're in Matthew 26, begin reading with me in verse 26. Verse 26. And as they were eating, now I'll comment a little bit about that as we close out too, but they were having a meal beforehand, and as that was winding down, that's when Christ did this. Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat. This is my body." Now, of course, it's a symbol, but it's a symbol of his very own body. In verse 27, then he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. For this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." A huge change here. Not like the first Passover that we read about, where the blood of a lamb protected them from a death angel passing through the land that night and the death of their firstborn. But here, Christ is saying, "This is my blood, shed for many for the remission of sins." I'll try and tie this together again a little more as we begin to close here after a bit. And Matthew also records, "I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." So this is going to continue. Here we have Christ completely changing the tradition of killing and eating a lamb. And again, in the original Passover, putting that blood on the sides and the top of the door frames. This is completely different. It's also completely different from the Passover sacrifice that was still being done by the Jews at that time, where they had the mass killing of lambs. But he's now identifying himself as the supreme sacrifice of a lamb. A lamb. Why do I say that with confidence? John chapter 1. Let's read together what a man named John the Baptizer said. John chapter 1. I won't read the context, but John is out preaching and baptizing out at the Jordan. But what I want to cover with you is only in verse 29. John 1:29. The next day John saw Jesus coming toward him, and he said, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." The Lamb of God, Jesus Christ. The real bondage that we are in is being stuck, if I could put it that way here, in Satan's world, Satan's influence all around us. And sin, the sin, quoting Paul, the sin that so easily besets us and so forth. And that leads to death, but that's the second death. But this Lamb, the Lamb of God, can take away that sin that would lead to the second death. Hebrews 9. Now we may briefly touch on this, some of these scriptures in the night of Passover, but in Hebrews chapter 9, I have more time in this sermon to give emphasis on this. What was the meaning of this third huge change in how the Passover was to be kept? Hebrews 9 tells us a lot. I won't read the entire chapter, but there's so much here. I do want to read with you beginning in verse 11. Hebrews 9, verse 11. Christ came as high priest of the good things to come with a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, not of this creation. Christ came with his own body to be sacrificed. Verse 12. Not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood. Now, he shed blood too. We know that. Christ, who was the Son of Man in human flesh, but also the Son of God. He shed his own blood, but it says he entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. This is huge. This is the sacrifice of the Lamb of God, which can cover every sin I've committed or will commit as long as I repent. It's the same for you. Let's read a little more here. Verse 13. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh. Now that again was some of the ancient ritual required. But verse 14, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God. Remember the lamb that was to be selected, was to be without blemish. Christ also fulfilled that perfectly. Not just in being, we presume, a man who took care of his body and was in good health, but far, far more than that. He never committed sin. You can prove that again from the Bible. He offered himself without spot to God. That should cleanse our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. And for this reason, he is the mediator of the new covenant by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. The blood of the Lamb back in Egypt saved the firstborn from being killed that night. But that was simply a physical death. This, Christ's sacrifice, allows us to have, as it says, the eternal inheritance. Our sins being blotted out by our loving Savior. I'd like to read a little more in this chapter. Would you go with me, please, to verse 26. Actually, I think I have time. Let's read verse 23. Still in Hebrews 9, but verse 23. Therefore it was necessary that the copies of the things in the heavens, which, we found anciently in the tabernacle, temple, and so forth, but they were the copies of the things in the heavens, should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. Not the lambs and the kids again. Verse 24, for Christ has not entered the holy place made with hands, which are copies of the true. Now the holy place made with hands, the priests took blood in there. But Christ didn't go there. None of his blood was ever taken there. So let me continue reading. Christ has not entered the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Not that he should offer himself often, as the high priest enters the most holy place every year with the blood of another. Now that was done on the Day of Atonement, which ties in as well. But in verse 26, if he had to do that, then he would have had to have suffered often since the foundation of the world. But now, once, at the end of the ages, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this the judgment, so Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time apart from sin for salvation. Salvation. One sacrifice of this Son of God, the Lamb, which takes away the sin of the world, supersedes the blood of every lamb or kid that was ever killed previously. It does. I want to nail something down in 1 Corinthians 11. There are some pretty clever arguments out there that what I want to touch on is timing here, but also the continuing of taking the symbols that Christ instituted, which we read about back in Luke and then in Matthew. Timing. You can sometimes be confronted with a clever argument that Jesus Christ instituted these symbols at the beginning of the 14th because he had to be sacrificed the next day. But that the keeping of the Passover would then revert to the very end of the 14th, going into the 15th. If you haven't been confronted with that argument, chances are you will be. It's a challenge to some in the Church of God right now. If you're in 1 Corinthians 11 now, I want to really nail down something. First of all, verse 1, the very beginning of the chapter, verse 1, Paul said, "You imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ." So he says, you follow me. And what I'm doing is I am following him. In verse 23. In verse 23, here's what Paul said. "For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus on the same night, or on the night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he said, 'Take, eat. This is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' And then he also rehearses. Verse 25, in the same manner, he took the cup. We read about that in 2 different Gospels. 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim, you remember the Lord's death till he comes.'" A key phrase is back there in verse 23. "I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord on the same night, or in the night which he was betrayed, took bread." And he makes no statement that this should be done any differently. And hence that's what we do. Are you aware, Jews at least, Orthodox Jews, and actually many Jews, will still observe the Passover? When? One night after we do. Correct? I don't have time to go into the background of that. But we are doing exactly as what Jesus Christ did, and Paul said, you continue that. What I received from him, I'm also delivering to you on that night. On that night. The holy day did not begin, or the 15th did not begin until late the following day. By that time, he was in the tomb. So he couldn't have kept it anyway with them. However, it doesn't matter. There are so many clever arguments out there. We do it on the same night he did, and as Paul instructed the church in Corinth to do the same. You go back up to verse 17. Here, I want to cover briefly some other instructions. Now, in giving these instructions, he said, I don't praise you. Now he's correcting them about something here. Since you come together, not for the better, but for the worse. First of all, when you come together as a church. Now, here's a change again. Paul's alluding to this. There's no more temple at this time. They're simply coming together as a congregation, and that's what we do. So in this third point again, the great change in keeping the Passover is not only the symbols, but we keep it again as congregations. Let me continue. He says, verse 18, first of all, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. And he said, I partly believe that. There must also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you. So let's not be causing division here. But verse 20, therefore, when you come together in one place, excuse me, that's how we do it. Not individually, in our homes, as back in Exodus 12, nor going to one place, as they did in the times of the temple, the tabernacle, but we come together again in one place as congregations. Let me continue reading. It is not to eat the Lord's Supper. That phrase is used a lot today. It's not to eat the Lord's Supper, he said. For in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others. One is hungry and another is drunk. He's condemning them for what they're doing. He said, what? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? You've got your own homes. That's where you have your meals. Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you. He was condemning what they were doing. They were not to come together for a group meal. We do that on the night to be much observed, a triumphant time, but not on the night of Passover. We come together simply to take the symbols of Christ's broken body and his shed blood to renew our covenant made with God and with Jesus Christ at baptism. You know, this actually condemns, if you will, the Seder meal. I'm not here to denigrate everything about what the Jews do, but they are not following Christ. And of course, indeed, so many of them, the bulk of them, don't recognize Christ anyway, although you do have Messianic Jewish groups who accept Christ, but also cling to so many of the traditions. The Seder meal, if you read about that. We don't do that. Paul said, you've got homes in which to eat and drink and have your meals. Coming together on the Passover evening is a very solemn occasion, and all we take is that little. We don't drink 4 cups. We take that little glass of wine, that precious symbol, and that small piece of broken unleavened bread, a symbol for Christ's body. I don't think we have big challenges right here. I hope we don't. But we do have in other places in the church of God. And I'm preparing you. 2 years ago, not here, but in another place, I was confronted with this. That we should actually have a meal. The very thing Paul said, and I tried to, I'm raising my voice right now. I don't know why. I'm not upset here with anyone, but And I was trying to be patient at the time. I was trying to explain to the man who was confronting me, no, we don't have a Seder meal or any meal. And I went through what I just went through with you. And then he said, shouldn't we be eating a lamb also that night? No. We take the symbols of the Lamb of God. I have never seen the man again. He was a member of the church, along with another household that got caught up in these things. We keep the New Covenant Passover at the time and in the way that Christ instituted. We do not in any way keep a Jewish Passover. We keep the Christian Passover. I didn't have time to talk about the symbolism of circumcision, but there's great symbolism there with baptism. We don't physically circumcise, but we'd better be circumcised in the heart. That's why unbaptized members are not allowed to participate in the Passover, taking the symbols with us, or the washing of feet. I'm sorry, I didn't have enough time to do that one justice. By the way, Mr. Lamore may have passed this on. Someone who is contemplating baptism is welcome to attend and observe. We have said that for a long time. They could not take the symbols, as those of us do who are baptized, and indeed we must. But again, they would be allowed to observe as they contemplate baptism and the commitment that is. Brethren, is it clear to you how the history of this progressed? All the way back in Exodus 12, the blood of the Lamb. It was all picturing something ahead as the second way of observing in Deuteronomy. But again, even though they had to go to the place where the Lord chooses and priests were sacrificing the lambs, that is still looking ahead to what you and I must do. Nothing more, nothing less. On the evening of April 21st this year, at sundown, the Passover service will begin. Think of what it means. Everything in history was pointing to what Christ instituted there in 31 AD, and we're still doing it. Do it with confidence and faith that you're doing exactly what Christ wants, and it leads to eternal life.